Hello there tonight. We are going to ease back into the flickering gaslight of 19th century London, where carriages rattle along cobbled streets and the air smells faintly of coal smoke, perfume and the pressure of reputation. The world around you is dressed in layers, silk lace, starch, and expectation. And somewhere inside a drawing room framed by heavy drapes and porcelain clocks, a girl of 16 is being told that she will be presented. You probably won't survive. Because Victorian marriage didn't begin with love or longing, it began with preparation, positioning, polishing, the slow choreography of turning a girl into an asset, not for herself, but for the family, and for the man who might one day make her disappear beneath his name. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It started young, often terrifyingly young. By the time a girl reached 14 or 15, the wheels were already in motion. Tutors were swapped out for elocution coaches. Music became less about enjoyment and more about demonstrating taste. French wasn't just a language, it was a social accessory. Deportment, posture, and hand position while pouring tea all became lessons in femininity. Not too bold, not too meek, just enough to catch an eye without being called forward. And of course, the body was shaped. Corsets weren't just fashion, they were discipline. Daily reminders that your breath waistline and even comfort belonged to the system you were being groomed for. Mothers measured, maids pulled laces tighter. There was pride in how long a girl could go without fainting. Then came the season. London's social season was a 5-month marathon of balls, luncheons, teas, and visits. For the aristocracy and upper middle class, this was not leisure. It was business. A debutante freshly out in society would be presented to the Queen if eligible, and thereafter spend her time performing interest, availability, and docile charm in as many rooms as possible. The point to be noticed, not for your ideas, but for your breeding, your grace, your connections, and above all, your marriage potential. Mothers watched everything, fathers arranged introductions, aunts whispered rumors. A successful season could land you a match by summer's end. A failed one could leave you lingering unmarried, aging increasingly invisible. Some girls had 2 or 3 seasons. A few had more. But with each passing year, the price of not being chosen went up. They called it being left on the shelf. And the shame of it could shadow a family name. Odd fact, the average age of marriage for upper-class women was around 22. But the pressure began nearly a decade earlier, and girls who hit 25 unwed, socially suspect, possibly too opinionated, maybe even, God forbid, difficult. And so matches were made, not over candlelit dinners or dreamy walks through foggy gardens, but during awkward conversations over card tables during managed dances where each spin was monitored by 4 pairs of watchful eyes. He would ask for a dance. She would accept. They'd twirl politely, ask each other questions like, do you hunt? And do you summer in Bath? And what does your father do? Again. Everything said was coded. Everything left unsaid was louder. If he liked her, he'd call. If she liked him, she'd pretend she didn't until it was clear he liked her enough. Courtship was a strategy. The aim was not passion. The aim was stability, legitimacy, respectability. And if the man had a title, even better, because marrying up meant social mobility for the entire family. Marrying down unthinkable, unless the man had an extraordinary amount of money, because money covered a multitude of social sins. Once a courtship became official, it often involved very little time alone. Letters were exchanged, chaperone visits continued, and the couple slowly began to imagine what life might look like together without actually being able to see each other in private. It's hard to fall in love under observation, and harder still when your main value has been assigned to your trousseau, your father's holdings, or the shine of your hair under gaslight. Still, some did fall in love. They found ways. A squeeze of the hand in the carriage, a long glance in the garden, a shared joke in the middle of a conversation about pheasants. Historians still debate how many Victorian marriages began with genuine affection. Some accounts suggest many couples grew to love one another after marriage. Others paint a grimmer picture of alliances held together by routine pressure or fear. Either way, the match had to happen, because not marrying wasn't just a personal failure. It was a social danger. Unmarried women had limited legal power, no access to property, no respectable independence. They were burdens to their families, objects of pity or ridicule, rarely free and never safe from judgment. So the girls danced, smiled, waited, and when the right man came and made the right inquiries, they hoped, not for fireworks, but for decency, for steadiness, for a life where they might be seen, even just a little, and if not, well, there were worse fates than marriage. At least that's what they were told. And so the curtain rose, the audience clapped, and the performance of Victorian marriage began long before anyone said, "I do." He doesn't get down on one knee. There's no velvet box, no ring glinting beneath fairy lights, no spontaneous speech about souls, stars, or destiny. The Victorian proposal, at least among the respectable classes, is a quiet formality, an exchange more legal than lyrical, more business merger than grand gesture. He asks for her hand, yes, but only after asking her father, sometimes even her brother, or her guardian, because a young woman, no matter how charming or educated, is not considered capable of managing such decisions herself. And if he's approved, then and only then can he express interest directly. Even then, he might never actually say, "Will you marry me?" It could be implied, through his regular visits, through gifts, through increasingly personal conversation. And when the engagement is understood, the families begin to act accordingly. Furniture is discussed, names are etched into handkerchiefs. A notice might appear in the newspaper, elegantly vague. An engagement has been announced between Mr. J.H. Weatherby and Miss C., Elspeth Moore, daughter of the late Colonel Moore. The couple, meanwhile, exist in a strange limbo. They are not yet married, but no longer just acquaintances. They are tied together publicly, but not intimately. The relationship is defined not by closeness, but constraint. They can write letters so long as someone else sees them. They can walk together so long as someone else follows a few paces behind. Any sign of improper closeness could jeopardize the engagement. Any break in etiquette might invite scandal. And if one of them backed out, well, then things could get legally messy. Odd fact, Victorian England allowed for lawsuits in the case of breach of promise. If a man withdrew from an engagement after offering it, the woman could sue him for reputational damage, and many did. Courts awarded compensation to jilted brides, especially if they had already made public their preparations or worse, their feelings. Historians still debate how much these engagements were about love versus alliance. Some say the system was pragmatic, a method of organizing property people, and legacy with as little chaos as possible. Others argue it was a way to control women, disguising lifelong dependence behind the lace veil of ceremony. The truth, of course, lives somewhere in the middle. Some engagements were deeply wanted, some were quietly endured, some were prayed for, others were survived. And once it was accepted, the engagement triggered a flurry of activity, not romantic weekends or elopements, but practical, public-facing tasks. The bride-to-be assembled her trousseau. This was no simple wardrobe. It was a collection of everything she would bring into her new home: linens, gowns, underthings, gloves, parasols, sewing kits, writing boxes, sometimes even furniture. All of it meant to show readiness, wealth, and a touch of delicate womanhood. Her mother would oversee it. Her aunts would give advice. Her friends would gossip, "What color will the dress be?" Will there be pearls? Did you hear he has a summer house? She would smile. She would thank them. She would try not to feel like her entire body had become a dowry item on display. The man had preparations of his own. A house to ready, a staff to manage, agreements to sign. In many cases, the marriage settlement would be drawn up by lawyers detailing what the wife would bring, what the husband would provide, and what would happen if either party died. It was less till death do us part, and more here's the clause in case one of us stops breathing. But again, no one called this cold. They called it respectable, secure, the foundations of a good life. After all, this was what a girl was raised for. Not independence, not ambition. But the moment she stepped from Miss to Mrs., the moment she changed names, changed homes, changed everything, without question, without hesitation, with grace, she might feel fear. She might feel nothing at all. She might even be in love. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she was doing what was expected. And expectation in Victorian England carried more weight than happiness ever could. The closer the wedding came, the smaller her world became. Chaperones grew stricter, conversations became more hushed. She was now a future wife, a role not to be tarnished by laughter too loud or opinions too sharp. Her husband-to-be might continue with his usual routines, clubbing card games, conversations about parliament or pipes. He might not notice her shrinking, he might, but either way, the outcome was the same. They would marry, and the curtain would rise on Act 2. The wedding itself would be grand or modest, depending on the family's means. The white dress, once a rarity, was becoming fashionable, thanks in part to Queen Victoria herself. But regardless of fabric or flowers, the ceremony did one thing clearly: it erased the girl, and replaced her with a wife. From that moment forward, her signature would change, her title would shift, her mail would be redirected, and her future would narrow into a single corridor, paved by someone else's decisions. They would say she was lucky. They would toast her happiness. And when the carriage took her away, trailing rice and ribbons, the onlookers would smile, never knowing whether she was holding her breath out of joy or just to keep from disappearing entirely. The door closes. The guests vanish, leaving behind the lingering scent of roses and roasted lamb. The confetti has already been swept into a neat pile near the garden gate, and the leftover sponge cake is beginning to sweat under its sugar crust. The carriage wheels have quieted, and the household has returned to order polished, hushed anticipatory. Upstairs, in a bedroom arranged for charm more than comfort, a woman sits on the edge of a freshly monogrammed marriage bed, staring at the fire. Her hands are folded just so. Her corset pinches where her breath wants to go. Her name is already changed. She is a wife now, and she is gone. Not missing, not buried, not lost in any poetic sense, just legally no longer herself. Victorian England had a name for this coverture, a legal concept so old and dry it sounds harmless until you live under it. Coverture meant that the moment a woman said "I do," her legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's, like sugar stirred into tea. Sweet, silent, and utterly dissolved, she could no longer own property. She could not sign a contract. She could not vote, sue, or even keep her own earnings. If she painted, wrote, composed, he owned the rights. If she inherited money, it went to him, unless special legal documents had been prepared in advance, which they almost never were. Even her own jewelry, if gifted by him, technically wasn't hers anymore. She became civilly dead. And unlike actual death, there was no mourning period for this. Only congratulations. Odd fact, a husband could legally lock his wife in a room, take control of her inheritance, or even kidnap their shared children during a separation, and it was considered his right, not abuse. Historians still debate whether coverture was strictly enforced across all classes. In upper-class homes, some women maneuvered within it, managing estates, entertaining influential guests, guiding household staff with subtle authority. But in the eyes of the law, they were still extensions of their husbands, silent statues with keys they didn't own. The law said two become one. But what it meant was she becomes him, and he remains exactly himself. Even letters became dangerous. A woman could write her family her friends, but any correspondence could be read intercepted or burned by her husband. Privacy no longer applied to her, not in the bedroom, not in conversation, not in thought. One clergyman wrote in 1856, "The heart of a wife must beat to the rhythm of her husband's will, or it is a rebellious thing. It wasn't metaphor, it was daily life, and yet the world called it romantic." The marriage vow was seen as a surrender of self in service of harmony. It was praised in poems embroidered on samplers, engraved on brooches to love, honor, and obey. The obedience wasn't symbolic. It was structural. She could be taken to court for defiance. She could be labeled mad if she refused her duties. And worst of all, if he harmed her, she was expected to forgive. If she ran, she could be returned. If she wept, she was hysterical. If she complained, she was shamed. You'd think perhaps that in private at night she would at least retain her own body. But no. A married woman had no legal right to withhold intimacy. Her husband could demand it, and the law would protect him. The concept of marital rape didn't exist. Not in law, not in practice, not even in whispers. The act of marrying was seen as granting permanent consent, lifelong access, a contract not just of a household union but of bodily surrender. And if she objected, she was scolded, dismissed, mocked, or increasingly in the late 19th century sent to a doctor. The diagnosis? Hysteria. A catch-all condition used to explain any behavior that deviated from cheerful servitude. Tired hysteria, numb hysteria, dissatisfied hysteria. It justified everything, from cold baths to enforced bed rest, to yes, even genital massage administered by trembling young physicians who swore it was science. So not only did she vanish into law, she also vanished into medicine, into polite conversation, into the very walls of her new home. One woman unnamed in the records described her wedding night as the moment I understood silence could be louder than any scream. She never divorced. She never ran. She lived 40 more years in the same house, and no one ever knew what she carried. Because that's the other part no one tells you. Victorian wives were expected to be lovely and mute, obedient and unknowable, strong enough to raise children but delicate enough to swoon if the baby cried too loudly. And they were experts at hiding. They stitched their grief into embroidery. They poured it into letters they never sent. They whispered it, behind fans, behind gloves, behind smiles that knew how to break and still hold their shape. It is important to remember some marriages were warm, some husbands were kind, but the system did not require it. And that's what made it cruel. You could be lucky, or you could be trapped. But either way, the system worked the same. It said, this is your husband, this is your home, this is your life, this is your name. You may not change it, you may not leave it, you may not question it, you may only smile. The beauty of Victorian marriage, the floral language, the white lace, the ballroom scenes was never meant to protect women. It was meant to contain them, to make the cage pretty enough that no one asked where the door went. And so they lived quietly, carefully, invisibly, until perhaps one day, long after someone found their diary and read the one page they never meant to be seen. There's a knock at the door. Not the heavy sort like a landlord or tax collector. It's softer, polite. A tap of propriety. Your suitor has arrived. But you're not alone. Because in Victorian England, a woman is never truly alone, especially not with a man. Courtship, you see, is not about privacy. It's about performance. The moment he enters the drawing room, a third person is already there. Maybe it's your mother sipping tea with one raised eyebrow, or your younger brother pretending not to listen while loudly turning pages of a book he doesn't understand. Or your governess standing slightly too close, embroidery always in hand, but eyes never leaving your posture. This is the stage on which Victorian romance is meant to unfold. Everything must be implied. Interest must be disguised. Affection must be suggested with an almost imperceptible flick of the fan, a glance held one breath longer than polite, or a tremble in your voice when you mention poetry. He compliments your piano playing. You pretend not to have heard. He asks if you like to walk in the countryside. You say the weather lately has been very agreeable. The dialogue is not designed to reveal anything. It's designed to prevent scandal. And the scandal, ironically, would be if the two of you actually got to know each other. Because marriage isn't about knowing. It's about negotiating. And nothing kills the deal faster than familiarity. So you remain perfect, untouchable, a mystery wrapped in taffeta. Courtship was never meant to create intimacy. It was meant to maintain distance until the deal was sealed. The dates weren't called dates. They were visits, arranged by parents, orchestrated like theater. Every seat, every glance, every line of dialogue was staged. Even your dress was a form of communication. Pale colors for innocence, lace gloves for gentility, modesty in cut, even if the neckline nudged curiosity. Everything was a signal. But none of it could be too obvious. Odd fact, Victorian etiquette books warned against walking too eagerly with a male suitor. It might suggest unfeminine enthusiasm. A woman was advised to appear flattered, never expectant, gracious, never forward. Historians still debate whether this was self-protection or social coercion. Was it a shield against lecherous men, or a system designed to keep women so contained they forgot how to choose? You may think, surely they met somewhere outside these parlors, and yes, they did. At balls, garden parties, church services, but always under supervision, always with the understanding that what was being watched was not two people in love, but two families potentially merging, because behind every flirtation was an equation. How many pounds does she bring? What are his prospects? Who stands to gain if they marry? Who stands to lose? And so the girl curtsies. The boy bows. And 100 expectations hover like perfume in the room. Even if a woman dared to be bold, even if she confessed affection, showed genuine emotion, it could backfire. Too much eagerness made her look desperate. Too much wit made her threatening. Too much beauty made her suspicious. There was a narrow path to walk, and the edges were sharp. Some girls mastered it. Others fell. Some learned to play dumb to make the man feel smarter. Others let their eyes do the talking because words were too risky. And still others rebelled in the only way they could. They pretended indifference. They let courtship pass them by. They said no. So many times their mothers wept and their fathers fumed, and society called them odd. These women often became governesses, or stayed to care for aging parents, or simply vanished from public life. But those who said yes, they stepped deeper into the dance. The visits became more frequent, the letters more personal. Still, no one was ever alone. Even a walk in the garden came with a chaperone. Even a stolen glance could be discussed for weeks among neighbors. Reputation was currency. One misstep could bankrupt you, and if you thought this scrutiny was reserved only for women, you'd be mostly right, but not entirely. Men, too, were measured. Was he respectable? Was he earning enough? Was his family name clean? But if he had money, all sins could be softened. For a woman, no amount of charm could buy back a tarnished name. So she played the game carefully. She smiled just enough. She listened attentively. She answered with grace. She revealed nothing, because in this stage of the process, mystery was her only shield. There were no real conversations, only tests. Would he notice her intelligence without being threatened? Would she show enough affection without seeming improper? Would he ask about her interests? Would she pretend not to have any, and beneath it all, one truth remained? The courtship wasn't about her. It was about her ability to reflect well upon him. She was the mirror. He was the gaze. And if he liked what he saw, then came the proposal. Not in the moonlight, not on a bridge in Paris, probably in the drawing room in daylight, with parents just one wall away, and her reply softly spoken, with a blush. No jumping, no cheering, just a nod. And perhaps a yes. I would be honored. And so began the engagement. Not the start of knowing one another, but the end of pretending not to. And from that moment on, everything changed. But nothing truly became hers. Not yet. Because until the vows are spoken, a woman still belongs to her father, and after that, to someone else entirely. She stands perfectly still while the seamstress pins her bodice. Around her the room is a flurry of muslin and lace gloves draped over chair arms, veils folded and refolded, a string of pearls resting in an open velvet case. Her mother frets about the hem. Her aunt insists on ivory, not white. Her sister hums near the window, half listening, already dreaming of her own wedding someday. But beneath the silks and smiles and stitched embroidery lies the quiet foundation of it all, the dowry. Because for all the romance written in poems and whispered through fans, Victorian marriage was a financial transaction at its core. And nothing defined that transaction more clearly than the sum of money, property, or assets a bride brought into her husband's life. A dowry wasn't just a gift, it was security, leverage, insurance against a future where love might fade or never arrive at all. And without it, many women never married at all. In fact, matchmaking often began with numbers, not names. How much is she bringing? What's tied up in land? Are there investments, furniture, a London townhouse? A pretty face might capture a gaze, but a solid dowry closed the deal. Fathers spent years preparing for this moment, saving, negotiating, writing letters to cousins who owed them favors. Odd fact, in some wealthy families, girls were practically bartered between distant branches of nobility, like gilded chess pieces, traded to secure alliances, political favor, or to settle debts. Historians still debate whether dowries empowered women by giving them a stake in the marriage, or if they trapped them in roles where their worth was always measured in coin. The truth, likely both, because a wealthy dowry could offer a woman some bargaining power, perhaps a clause in the marriage settlement protecting a part of her income, or the ability to fund charitable work. But a poor woman, she had nothing to negotiate with. She entered the marriage with empty hands and endless debt, if she entered it at all. Middle-class families struggled the most, not rich enough to offer vast sums, not poor enough to expect their daughters to work. Caught in the middle, they embroidered pillowcases and saved porcelain to make the trousseau look more impressive than it was. They borrowed jewelry for the wedding portrait. They whispered their hopes into teacups and prayed that he wouldn't ask too many questions. And so daughters became investments. A family's financial future often depended on marrying well. Marrying well did not mean marrying kindly. It meant marrying upward, into property, into name, into stability. The bride might have no say in any of it. She might be told gently or not that this is her duty, that her parents had sacrificed too much for her to be picky. That affection would come later. That marriage is not for joy, but for survival. Some girls accepted this without protest. Others cried quietly into their pillowcases embroidered with someone else's initials. Still others resisted. They stalled, made excuses, claimed illness, turned down suitors with brittle politeness. But time was not their friend. The older a girl became, the smaller her dowry seemed. its value shrank in the eyes of potential grooms. A dowry's power was not just in the amount, but in the timing. An 18-year-old with $500 was a catch. A 26-year-old with the same sum was a warning sign. And yet, paradoxically, if the woman was widowed and inherited money, suddenly she was alluring again. Because widow's wealth didn't come with virgin expectations. It came with freedom. But for now, she is a bride, or nearly one, and the marriage settlement must be drawn. A formal document drafted by lawyers, reviewed by fathers and uncles, sometimes negotiated down to the last tea set. It lists the dowry, outlines the husband's responsibilities, determines what happens if she dies or if he dies or if, heaven forbid, she produces no heirs. This isn't cynicism, it's standard, and yet she has no say in it. She may not even read it. She just signs, carefully. In ink that trembles slightly with the weight of a future not yet hers to steer. When the wedding day arrives, everything appears radiant. Candles flicker, ribbons sway. The dress fits like destiny, but underneath her smile the bride knows her value has been tallied, not just in gold, but in expectations. She is to bear children, to be mild, to be loyal, to be useful, because the dowry may have opened the door, but it cannot guarantee affection on the other side. She may wake tomorrow with a husband who ignores her, or one who controls her with honeyed phrases and locked ledgers, or one who surprises her with gentleness she never expected. But she won't know until the papers are signed. The ring is on, the door clicks shut, and all the lovely things roses toll music fade into memory. What remains is the marriage, and the balance sheet beneath it. The morning after the wedding, the bells are quiet. The laughter has faded, the flower petals are limp in the gutter, and the guests have returned to their homes, humming waltzes and recounting the menu. She awakes in a room she did not choose, in a bed she has never slept in before, next to a man she barely knows but now belongs to. The linen is stiff with starch. Her hair still smells faintly of orange blossom. She is no longer a bride. She is a wife. And that means whether she understands it or not, she is expected to become a mother. Not eventually, not when she's ready, but soon. Immediately, before the year turns, preferably. In Victorian England, marriage wasn't the culmination of romance. It was the gateway to reproduction. That was its entire function in the eyes of society. The moment the ceremony ended, a quiet but all-consuming pressure began. A woman's value was still ultimately measured in lineage in children. A fertile wife was a good wife, and an infertile one, a quiet tragedy. There were no soft conversations about family planning, no shared dreams over tea and morning toast. There was only expectation. 1 month into the marriage, their eyes began to watch softly, politely behind fans and over knitting needles. By the 3rd month, inquiries were made. By the 6th, if her waistline had not thickened, someone would suggest a doctor, or a tonic, or a country visit, or perhaps most kindly of all, a prayer. But here's the cruelest part: she may not even understand what's expected of her. Sexual education for women was limited to superstition and metaphor. Mothers might say, "Just do as your husband says." Governesses might mutter something about obedience. Some girls went to their wedding beds not even knowing that children came from intercourse. They knew about babies, yes, but not how they arrived. The experience was often jarring, disorienting. Some women described their wedding nights as confusing, terrifying, even painful. They did not understand the mechanics. They did not know they could say no. And even if they had known, what would it change? Legally, a wife could not refuse her husband. There was no concept of consent inside marriage. His right to her body was assumed. Permanent. Absolute. Odd fact, Victorian etiquette manuals intended for brides often described sex in euphemisms so vague they were useless. One instructed women to lie still and think of England, a phrase now infamous for capturing the blend of duty and detachment expected of marital intimacy. Historians still debate whether this quote was ever widely used or if it became legend later, but the idea behind it held firm sex was not for pleasure. It was for procreation. And procreation was a woman's responsibility. If she became pregnant, she was congratulated, applauded, watched even more closely. Her cravings were discussed like weather patterns. Her mood was treated as a public property, and if she lost the child or failed to carry the sorrow, was overlaid with suspicion. Had she been too active, read too many novels, taken cold baths, displeased her husband? The science of reproduction was shaky at best. Women were told to avoid excitement, to remain calm, to focus on pleasant thoughts, to avoid looking at anything ugly for fear it might imprint upon the baby's face or soul. The blame for miscarriage was often laid squarely at the woman's feet, whether through bad blood, bad morals, or just bad luck. Still, many women had child after child. Some birthed 5, others 10. One woman, anonymously writing in 1881, recorded the births of 13 children over 15 years, only 8 of whom survived. The others were buried quietly in the back corners of churchyards with small stones or no stones at all. She named them in her diary, but never aloud. Even grief had to be modest, and yet even surviving birth didn't spare her from pressure. The moment she stopped bleeding, the cycle began again, because motherhood wasn't just about having children, it was about continuing to have them. A healthy womb was a working womb. Victorian families aimed to be large, especially in rural communities where children were labor. In aristocratic households, children were a legacy. Either way, she had to keep going. Her body didn't matter. Her rest didn't matter. Her consent didn't matter. Only continuity. There were exceptions, brave ones, women who refused, who locked their bedroom doors or feigned headaches, who learned from maids about certain teas and tinctures that might prevent conception. Queen Victoria herself reportedly disliked pregnancy and birth, describing it as an ordeal she dreaded. And yet, even queens weren't immune from expectation. She bore 9 children. For the average woman, there was no space for refusal. If she protested, she was selfish. If she wept, she was weak. If she hesitated, she was unnatural, and yet they endured. They rocked their cribs with hands swollen from labor. They bathed in silence while the house slept. They buried babies without eulogies. And when their husbands returned to bed 2 weeks later, they opened their arms again because saying no wasn't an option. Some women wrote letters they never sent. Some scribbled verses between laundry instructions. Some dreamed of escape but never packed a bag, because there was nowhere to go. A woman with no husband and no child and no family. She vanished. But a mother, she endured. Even if she died by 35, even if her body broke down by 40, even if she stopped speaking altogether and simply moved like a ghost through a house full of names she herself had chosen but rarely heard. And so Victorian marriage moved forward not as a story of romance, but of repetition. One birth, then another, then another. A cycle of flesh and fear and false gratitude. And through it all, she was expected to smile, to be grateful, to whisper, "I'm so lucky," even when no one asked what she wanted, even when she no longer remembered. The gentleman of the house arrives home late. His boots are cleaned. His supper is warmed. His pipe is placed in the study exactly where he prefers it, angled slightly left, not right, so the ash won't fall on the inkwell. His wife, ever proper, greets him with a soft welcome home. She does not ask where he's been. She does not ask why he smells faintly of port and perfume that does not belong to her, because she is a Victorian wife, and she knows a husband's word is law. In this world, the power structure within marriage is not just cultural. It's legal, explicit, undeniable, The man is not a partner. He is a master. The household runs in his name. The decisions are his to make. The property is his to own, even if she brought it with her, even if it was her inheritance, even if it once sat in her father's drawing room. She cannot challenge him publicly. She cannot refuse him privately. If she does, the consequences will not be his. They will be hers. His authority extends to every part of her world. What she wears, who she sees, what she reads, what she spends. Some men control their wives with affection, others with accounting. Either way, the message is the same: you are mine and mine alone. If he forbids her from visiting her sister, she stays home. If he disapproves of her novel, it disappears from the nightstand. If he dislikes her friend, that friend is quietly erased from her invitations. She lives in the shadows of his preferences, navigating every choice like a narrow hallway, careful not to knock anything over. And yet, from the outside, their marriage may look ideal. He smiles at parties. She nods politely. They dance at Christmas. They exchange cards. But beneath the surface is a contract written in silence, in obedience, in fear sometimes, but more often in resignation. Odd fact, in England, prior to the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, any wages a woman earned through writing, sewing, even shopkeeping, automatically became her husband's property. He could take her money, spend it, gamble it, and she had no legal right to protest. Historians still debate whether Victorian husbands understood the depth of their control. Some were benevolent, some indifferent, some cruel. But the structure did not depend on intention. It depended on unquestioned power. Even kind husbands held authority that could be weaponized at any time. Even gentle men could in one moment become jailers without bars, because the law said so, the church said so, society said so. And for a woman, there was no higher appeal. If she rebelled, if she raised her voice, refused a request, disobeyed a rule, she was not just a bad wife. She was unnatural, ungrateful, possibly unwell. Victorian medicine was quick to pathologize disobedience. A wife who read too much was considered unbalanced. One who argued was hysterical. One who refused sex was cold. One who cried too often was melancholic. Doctors prescribed fresh air sedatives, cold baths. Sometimes they prescribed silence. And many women complied, whether from fear, from exhaustion, or because they knew no other way. Some found small rebellions, tiny acts of defiance hidden like buttons sewn inside a hem. She might overcook his favorite meal once. She might burn a letter. She might spend a coin on something frivolous just once, just to feel the thrill of choosing. She might write a journal hidden behind her corsets, filled with thoughts no one would ever read. But these moments were rare, risky, because a husband could retaliate at any time. He could cut off her allowance. He could humiliate her in front of guests. He could remove her from the home altogether. And if she left him, she would have no money, no children, no protection. He kept the children, by law. She would be a woman alone in a world that considered that a contradiction. So she stayed. She learned how to bend, how to defer, how to smile through dismissal, how to listen as he recited opinions she'd read years earlier, and be sure to nod as if hearing them for the first time. She learned the art of disappearance, not literal, but slow, subtle, a fading of self like ink in the sun. And yet within that fading, some women still found ways to breathe. They formed secret clubs. They wrote fiction under false names. They met for tea and shared glances filled with more understanding than words ever could. And though their husbands ruled their homes, they could not control every thought, every hope, every flicker of self that refused to be entirely extinguished. Because even in the most tightly bound life, some corners remain ungoverned. Some quiet parts whisper, "You are more than this." And while she may never say it aloud, while she may never act on it, She hears it every night just before sleep. The voice that says you are still here, even if no one sees you, even if no one listens, even if the law belongs to him. This moment belongs to you. The house is immaculate. The windows glisten from their weekly washing, the silver gleams under candlelight. The nursery smells of lavender sachets, boiled milk, and the faint tang of chalk dust. Dinner is served promptly at 7. Linen napkins folded precisely. Glassware polished. Butter shaped into a rose. She smiles when guests arrive. She smiles when they leave. She smiles even when her husband retreats to his study without a word. Because this is her role, her performance. And in the age of Queen Victoria, it is the highest role a woman can attain, the angel in the house. The phrase came from a poem Coventry Patmore's ode to his late wife, but it grew beyond poetry. It became a doctrine, a moral standard, a haunting. To be the angel meant to be pure, soft-spoken, unshakably kind. She was to serve without asking, endure without protest, heal without faltering. She was to be the flame that warmed the home and never burned, the flower that bloomed in every season but never wilted. She was, in short, expected to be perfect and perfectly invisible. It was a title bestowed with reverence, but one that demanded a life of quiet self-erasure. A woman in this mold could not be angry. She could not desire. She could not need. Her joys were expected to be small and domestic, a well-folded sheet, a perfect sponge cake, the complement of a visiting vicar. Anything more suggested vanity, worldliness, or worse, ambition. The angel in the house was not curious. She did not read too much. She did not question her husband. She certainly did not write her own story. And yet she was everywhere idealized in novels, painted into portraits, preached from pulpits, passed down through lullabies and etiquette manuals. She was what every daughter was trained to become, what every mother whispered about in the kitchen, what every husband expected, even if he didn't say it. Odd fact, Victorian etiquette guides warned women never to laugh too loudly in public. It was seen as vulgar attention-seeking. Better to smile sweetly and say nothing. That was the code. That was grace. Historians still debate whether this ideal gave women a subtle form of power as moral arbiters of the household, or whether it was simply a gilded cage. In truth, it was both. It honored women by denying them their complexity. If a woman was sad, she was delicate. If she was anxious, she was sensitive. If she was bored, she was tired, never angry, never restless, never defiant. And if she showed those things, she was not an angel, she was a failure. So she learned how to pretend, how to thank the neighbor for unsolicited advice, how to smile when her husband made a cruel joke at dinner, how to listen when someone told her she was lucky to be so well cared for. She learned to serve the tea just right, to walk without noise, to cry into handkerchiefs embroidered with someone else's initials. And slowly, without noticing, she disappeared. Not in body, not in voice, but in self. Because the angel in the house had no room for identity, only virtue. And virtue in her case meant being everyone's comfort and no one's burden. She was a nurse when someone fell ill, a host when someone visited, a seamstress, a cook, a mother, a wife. And in all of it, she was expected to ask for nothing. But people did not notice what was taken from her. They only praised what she gave. She's so composed, she's so patient, she never complains. And the more they said it, the more she had to be it. Because once people believe you don't need help, they stop offering it. And once they see your silence as peace, they forget to ask if you're okay. There were no words in polite society for postpartum depression, for burnout, for loneliness in a house full of people. And if a woman dared to speak those things aloud, she risked everything, her status, her sanity, her marriage. So she kept quiet. She wrote letters she never sent. She kept journals beneath floorboards. She whispered secrets into her infant's ear because he was the only one who couldn't judge. Sometimes she read novels under the covers long after the house was asleep. Austen, Bronte, Gaskell. Women who wrote what no one else dared say, who gave voice to what the angel could not. And yet even these small rebellions had limits. She could not throw the dishes. She could not scream in the street. She could not leave, because leaving meant scandal, and scandal meant exile. Even if her husband was cruel, even if her mind was breaking, she was expected to endure. And the world called it devotion. But inside she knew what it really was. Survival. Some women rebelled quietly. They found solace in other women, in friendships deeper than their marriages, in tea shared at 4 p.m. with someone who understood. Some escaped into charity work, others wrote poems under pseudonyms, others simply faded. She may have once dreamed of painting, of traveling, of becoming someone with a story, but now her story is written by others, by tradition, by law, by the whisper of curtains closing behind her as she moves from room to room unseen. And yet sometimes in the dark, when the fire has burned low and the house is still, she lets herself remember the girl she was. She closes her eyes and sees a sky she once longed to sail beneath. She hears laughter she no longer makes. She imagines what it might feel like to walk out the door and keep going. Not forever. Just far enough to remember her own name. And that small flicker of self, the ember in the center of her chest, it is not gone. It waits. And maybe one day it will burn again. The door to the bedroom is closed. The fire is low. The curtains are drawn tight against the night. And still her body tenses at the sound of his boots on the stairs. There is no violence, no raised voice, no bruises, nothing you could point to, nothing you could name. And yet her breath shortens, her thoughts race, her hands grip the blanket just a little too tightly. Because tonight, like so many nights before, intimacy is not about affection. It is about duty. And duty cannot be refused. Victorian marital intimacy was a paradox shrouded in silence, heavy with implication governed by expectations no one openly discussed. A woman was expected to serve her husband's desires, but never to express her own. She was to submit without question, yet remain modest, to be available yet never enthusiastic. If she enjoyed the act, she was immodest. If she dreaded it, she was frigid. There was no winning, only enduring. From the moment she said "I do," her body became not just his legal possession, but his marital entitlement. There was no concept of consent within marriage. The law assumed that marriage itself was consent, a permanent, unrevocable yes. Whatever occurred between a husband and wife in the privacy of their bedroom was beyond scrutiny, beyond justice, beyond empathy. And so she endured. Night after night, even when she was exhausted, even when she was ill, even when she had just buried a child. Because to say no was not just impolite, it was insubordinate. Odd fact. The legal notion that a husband could not rape his wife persisted in British law until 1991. That's not a typo. The legal system upheld the idea that marriage granted blanket sexual access well into the 20th century. Historians still debate how common marital affection really was in Victorian England. Diaries and letters reveal a wide range. Some women adored their husbands and spoke of deep tenderness. Others expressed confusion, sadness, even trauma. Some accounts are almost clinical. He visited me again tonight as if intimacy were an intrusion, not a shared moment. And where did women learn what to expect? Not from school, not from their mothers, certainly not from books. The subject was taboo. Most girls entered marriage with only vague euphemisms to guide them. You'll understand soon enough. Just follow his lead. be patient. Some were told it would be unpleasant but brief. Others weren't told anything at all. They discovered on their wedding night that their lives would be divided into two parts, before and after. Before was mystery, after was resignation. And yet even in the shadow of this silence there was pressure to conceive. If she did not become pregnant quickly, the questions began. Was she too cold? Too thin, too stubborn? Did she lack passion? It was never his fault, never his health, never his disinterest, always hers. So she adjusted. She tried harder. She visited doctors who prescribed tonics and rest cures. She drank iron mixtures that made her sick. She prayed. She learned to dissociate, to let her mind wander while her body did what was expected, to think of the children, or the curtains, or a poem she had read last week. She learned that it was easier to smile afterward than to resist before, and when it was over she turned toward the wall. Even in loving marriages this pattern could take hold, because the entire system was built on silence. You didn't talk about what you wanted. You didn't talk about what you feared. You certainly didn't talk about what you didn't enjoy. Desire. Female desire was considered unseemly, even dangerous. To express longing was to confess deviance. To ask for more was to risk everything. So she buried those feelings deep. She told herself she was lucky, that many women had it worse, that he was kind in other ways, that this was just what marriage was. And in that quiet room, night after night, she forgot what it felt like to be touched with tenderness. She forgot what it meant to be seen. She forgot that her body was once her own. And sometimes in the middle of the night, she would wake to the sound of her own breathing, and it would startle her, because it meant she was still here, still in this body, still enduring, still unseen. There were women who tried to speak, who hinted at their unhappiness to their doctors, who cried to their sisters, who wrote in secret diaries that they could not keep doing this. And sometimes those women were listened to. But more often they were diagnosed with hysteria, with melancholia, with nervous exhaustion. And once labeled, they were no longer wives. They were patients, removed from the dinner parties, sent to sanatoriums, prescribed opiates and isolation and long walks with no destination. It was easier to medicate the symptom than question the cause. Easier to quiet the woman than challenge the man. Easier to say she's not well than to ask why she cries when no one is looking. Still, a few found ways to reclaim something of themselves. They wrote fiction under false names. They studied quietly in the hours before dawn. They raised their daughters differently, teaching them gently that they had choices. They held onto small freedoms, a locked journal, a favorite chair, a poem memorized and repeated like prayer. Because when you are denied your voice, even the echo of it matters. And in the quietest corners of their lives, they remembered. They were not angels. They were not ideals. They were women. And women deserve more than silence. She walks into the parlor with tea balanced perfectly on a tray. Her dress is spotless, her hair arranged without flaw. She asks her guests about their husbands, their children, their household staff. She does not speak of herself. Not really, not honestly. Because the perfect wife, the Victorian ideal, must not complain. She must not burden. She must never admit that she is tired, overwhelmed, or disappointed. That would be unseemly. That would be dangerous. This perfection was not just expected, it was enforced. Socially, culturally, internally. The good wife was not simply tidy and gracious. She was tireless. She made everything look effortless even when it was anything but. She was the glue in every household. The calendar, the nurse, the chef, the governess, the hostess, the moral compass. And above all, the smiling face that reassured everyone else that the household was fine. Even when it wasn't. especially when it wasn't. To say otherwise was to invite judgment. Whispered gossip at the market, raised eyebrows from the vicar's wife, concerned looks from your own mother. Is everything all right, dear? Perhaps you're simply overtired, because tiredness was acceptable, but discontent. Discontent was rebellion, odd fact. The phrase "the angel in the house" wasn't just poetry. It was used in medical journals, sermons, political speeches. A shorthand for the ideal woman. But the irony, as Virginia Woolf later noted, was that the angel had to die for a woman to write truthfully. Historians still debate how many Victorian women believed in this ideal and how many simply performed it. Many letters from the time suggest a knowing double consciousness. A woman would describe her daily routine in glowing terms only to add, "But I do confess I long for a room of my own, and a full hour where I am not asked for anything." The illusion was powerful. It told women they were special, chosen to nurture, to uphold the home, to bring beauty into a grey industrial world. But it did not give them space to be fully human, to be angry, to be messy, to be unsure. She was expected to console her husband when he returned from work, even if he had ignored her letters for days. To entertain guests with elegance, even if she had lost a pregnancy the week before. To raise children with patience, even if she hadn't eaten a full meal since yesterday, because the staff had spoiled the roast. She smiled through all of it. Because that's what good wives did. And the better she performed, the less people noticed her suffering. Because pain, when hidden well, is mistaken for strength. She was not allowed to ask for help, not from her husband, who might say, "You've got everything a woman could want," not from her friends, who might say, "Well, at least you have children," not from her doctor, who might say a tonic and a nap will set you right. So she asked nothing, she said nothing, she simply endured. But endurance without recognition becomes something else. It becomes isolation, the kind that cannot be cured by sleep or wine or a walk around the garden. The kind that eats away at your sense of self until you forget what it ever meant to be a person who laughed out loud, who spoke her mind, who cried without apologizing. Some women did cry, in closets, in carriages, in the middle of the night, sitting at the edge of the bed while their husbands slept soundly beside them. Some stopped crying altogether, because the tears felt like weakness, and weakness was shameful. Others turned inward into nervous tics, stomach pains, headaches, vague illnesses that baffled physicians but made perfect sense to anyone who knew what it was like to carry 1,000 invisible expectations. The perfect wife was never sick, but she was always unwell, always tired, always almost at the edge of something. A few crossed that edge. They packed a small bag and fled. They left notes on kitchen tables. They disappeared into train stations. Some came back. Most didn't. They were spoken of in hushed tones. Poor thing. She was delicate. She was not quite right. The husband, of course, was consoled, and often remarried, but her name lived on like a shadow proof of what happens when a woman forgets her place. So the others stayed. They clipped flowers. They planned menus. They raised boys who would grow up to inherit their father's authority, and girls who would learn to smile through everything. But not all of them forgot. Some remembered. Some wrote stories thinly veiled, carefully phrased about women who disappeared without permission. Some painted. Some walked longer and farther each day, whispering poems beneath their breath like spells. Some raised daughters differently. Some simply looked in the mirror every morning and said very quietly, "I am still here." And in a world that expected them to vanish behind lace curtains and polite laughter, that was an act of extraordinary defiance. She rises before the sun. The hearth is cold, the sky still pale, and already her list is forming. Boil the water, feed the baby, polish the silver, smile. Always smile. The Victorian wife must begin her day with grace, not because she feels it, but because she must appear to. Her role is one of relentless choreography, every movement calculated, every sentence practiced. She is expected to be the heart of the home, but only if that heart beats quietly, beautifully, without complaint. Perfection is not requested of her. It is required. She must be warm, but never needy. She must be clean, but never vain. She must be wise in the ways of children, but ignorant in matters of politics. She must be submissive in public and selfless in private, even when no one is looking, especially then. Her world runs on invisible labor. Tea appears at the perfect temperature. Children are scrubbed, dressed, and instructed not to interrupt father. Laundry folds itself, dinner roasts itself, candles replenish themselves so long as she is there to work behind the curtain like a servant in pearls. And yet she must never look tired, never act rushed, never admit to breaking under the weight. She must carry it all and make it look light. That's what makes her good. Not her love, her silence. Odd fact, women were instructed to keep a household book of tasks, groceries, and menus. If their husbands glanced at it, he might see a well-run home. If he didn't, that was her success. His ignorance was her perfection. Historians still debate whether these standards offered women a sense of pride or merely imprisoned them. Perhaps it was both a trap so intricately decorated some mistook it for honor. To be the perfect wife was to navigate an emotional maze with no map. Your husband comes home late. You don't ask questions. That would be distrustful. He offers no compliment on the roast. You don't sulk. That would be petty. You're lonely. You don't say it. That would be weak. You smile. Because the world has no patience for wives who aren't happy. When you are praised, it is for how little you ask, how soft your voice is, how well your children behave. Your reputation is not your own. It is your husband's, your children's, your wallpapers, and your feelings. They are your burden alone. She is expected to be a lamp in the window, always glowing, always graceful. No flickering, no burnout, no questions. If she falls ill, she is told to rest, but only in a ladylike way. A fainting spell is acceptable. A migraine perhaps, but not sadness. Never sadness. Not the kind that sits in your bones and makes you wonder what happened to the girl you once were. She speaks carefully at dinner, never too clever, never too quiet. Just enough to flatter, to soften, to entertain, but never to challenge. The perfect wife is not an equal. She is a complement. She is his mirror polished daily. And if she cracks, she is replaced, or pitied, or forgotten. So she hides the cracks. She learns to cry in silence, to bleed invisibly, to mask her fury as fatigue, her despair as decorum. Some nights she lies awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would notice if she vanished. Not physically, but emotionally. What if she simply stopped pretending, stopped smiling, stopped bending, stopped baking the world's expectations into every loaf of bread? Would they notice? Would they care? Some women broke from within, others walked away. Not many, but a few. They left behind everything, their names, their homes, their reputations, and they were shamed for it, vilified, erased. The newspapers called them mad. Their husbands called them ungrateful. The neighbors called them tragic. No one called them brave, but some who stayed found smaller ways to survive. They wrote, they painted, they carved out moments in the attic, in the garden, in the gaps between service and supper to breathe like themselves again. They raised their daughters differently. They whispered secrets to each other at sewing circles, words of comfort, resistance, sometimes just acknowledgement, I see you. Because sometimes that's all it took to make it through another day. She learned to find power in tiny rebellions, burning a letter, keeping a coin for herself, refusing to wear the ribbon he liked. These acts were not dramatic, but they were hers, and sometimes they were enough to keep her heart from calcifying completely. She made peace with her invisibility by choosing when to be seen and when to disappear. She told herself she was good. because that was safer than admitting she was lost, and the world, seeing her smile, believed it. They always do, but inside in the quiet she knew perfection was never the point. Survival was. And sometimes survival looked like a folded napkin and a whisper no one heard. She wakes earlier now, not from duty, but from habit. Before the bells chime, before the servants shuffle downstairs, before anyone calls her name. The bedroom is still bathed in early morning grey. For just a few minutes, the day hasn't yet asked anything of her. She can lie still and pretend that she is not a wife, not a mother, not a woman bound to any script, just a body, breathing, remembering. These quiet mornings have become a kind of lifeline, because once the day begins, it does not stop. She is expected in every room, needed in every moment. She moves from child to husband to staff to guest, smoothing, soothing, correcting, appearing. And nowhere in that circuit is there space to simply be herself. But now in her 40s, the routine feels different, less performative, more survivalist. She no longer tries to be charming at breakfast. She no longer forces herself to wear the yellow ribbon he liked in her hair. She no longer apologizes for being tired, because she is tired, deeply, constantly, in ways that no nap or holiday can fix. The children are older now. Some are married, one is abroad. One, her youngest, still crawls into bed with her on rainy mornings and says, "Mama, do you still remember what it was like to be little?" And sometimes she answers aloud, but more often she answers silently in the hollow part of her chest where her own childhood now lives. She does remember. Running through hedgerows, secret games in attics, laughter so loud it startled birds. But those memories feel like someone else's now. A girl who had not yet been shaped by corsets and contracts and careful silences. A girl who thought marriage was a story with a beginning, middle, and happy end. Instead, it was a loop, endless, rhythmic, monotonous, and sometimes achingly lonely. Odd fact. By the late Victorian period, some upper and middle-class women began seeing nerve doctors for what was termed neurasthenia, a vague diagnosis that included fatigue, anxiety, and emotional numbness. Many modern historians now view these symptoms as expressions of suppressed emotional trauma, isolation, and intellectual frustration. Historians still debate whether these women were seeking treatment or simply a name for their pain. For some, a diagnosis offered relief, a justification. For others, it was another box to be placed in another version of "you are the problem." She's tried to resist that label. For years, she thought resistance meant being strong. But now she knows resistance sometimes means being soft. Letting herself cry. Letting herself rest. Letting herself not finish the embroidery. There is a strength in refusal too. It starts small. She stops answering every call immediately. She lets the soup cool before serving. She reads in the study and doesn't rise when her husband enters. These things go unnoticed at first, and that's the point. They are hers, not performances, not obligations, just moments. A breath, a margin, a whisper of self-returning. And when she begins writing again, this time not in secret, but in a notebook left open on her nightstand, it is not revolutionary. It is not scandalous. It is ordinary. She writes about the roses, about her daughter's handwriting, about the way her own hands have changed, growing softer in some places, more weathered in others. And she writes one line again and again: "I am not done. Not done growing, not done remembering, not done being a woman with thoughts, longings, contradictions." Because being a Victorian wife did not erase those things. It only buried them. And now bit by bit she is digging them up. Some days she still feels invisible, but now she recognizes it. And when she feels it, she walks out of the parlor, into the garden, sometimes farther, not away from her life but into it, more deeply, more honestly, She speaks more plainly now. When a neighbor brags about her husband's promotion, she does not smile and nod. She asks, "And are you happy?" When her daughter says she wants to be a wife one day, she doesn't say, "That's lovely." She says, "Just make sure you stay a whole person too." Her husband notices the change. At first he resists, then he adjusts. Then surprisingly, he asks her a question. "What would you have done if you hadn't married?" And she laughs. Not because it's funny, but because it's the first time he's asked. And she answers, "I think I would have taught, or written books about strange places, or maybe I'd just have wandered for a while, just to know what it feels like." And he says nothing, but he doesn't laugh, and that she decides is something. So she keeps writing, she keeps walking, she keeps living, not in defiance, not in escape, but in fullness. Because the role of wife was never meant to be a mask, and the word woman was never meant to mean only service. She knows her story is not typical. Or maybe it is. Maybe it always was. Maybe there are hundreds of women just like her who are only now beginning to emerge from the silence that held them for so long. And maybe, just maybe, their voices, soft, slow, stubborn, will echo through journals, through daughters, through the quiet revolution of a woman who simply decides she is allowed to be whole. She stands at the window, the late afternoon light cutting long golden lines across the parlor rug. A pot of tea steams beside her untouched. Outside, the trees rustle gently, losing their leaves one by one. It is autumn again, the season she always loved as a girl, the air crisp, the colors vivid. And now in the quiet of this house, it makes her remember not just seasons, but versions of herself that have long since faded. She thinks of the girl who once twirled in orchards and spoke too loudly at supper. The one who dared to imagine herself doing something else, traveling, writing, painting, teaching. The one who wasn't always careful, before the corset, before the expectations, before the silence. This house has become a kind of memory box. Everything here speaks to a version of her that served. The polished sideboard, the faint scent of lavender and old books, the portraits of family members hung too high to reach but always watching. The rhythm of her life has slowed, but the questions have grown louder. What did it cost her to live so gently? What did she lose in being so good? She doesn't ask these questions aloud. Not at dinner, not at tea, not even to her closest friend, though sometimes their eyes meet and say all of it in silence. But she writes them now, in journals, in the margins of her recipe books. Even once daringly in a letter she never posted. She writes, not just because she wants to be heard, but because she wants to hear herself again. And that in itself feels like a quiet rebellion. Odd fact. In the late 1800s, a number of rest homes were created specifically for middle-class women suffering from nervous exhaustion. The women were given strict routines, bland meals, and complete isolation. In reality, many were simply suffering from intellectual boredom and emotional neglect. Historians still debate whether these institutions were genuinely meant to help or simply designed to remove difficult women from society. She thinks about that sometimes, what might have happened if she had stopped pretending earlier, if she had refused the role sooner, if she had said no and meant it. But instead she had chosen to remain, to perform, to endure, and in doing so she became invisible to everyone except herself. Now in her later years she is beginning to reappear. She speaks differently, slower, with weight, not for show, but for meaning. She no longer fills silence with apologies. She lets it breathe. And when people come to her for advice, she no longer tells them what they want to hear. She tells them what they may not be ready for. That marriage is not rescue. That motherhood is not completion. That being needed is not the same as being loved. She tells her daughter these things and watches her daughter blink, unsure if it's advice or confession. It's both. She isn't trying to rewrite her life. She's just trying to witness it, fully, without denial, without sentimentality. There is power in that, in remembering the hard parts without flinching, the long nights with sick children and no help, the years of being touched without tenderness, the small deaths of self she was never allowed to mourn. She doesn't need pity, she needs truth. And she's finally ready to give it to herself. She's begun organizing the attic, not to make space, to make sense. She opens old trunks, lifts out baby shoes, brittle letters, a dress she wore once and never again. And as she sorts, she tells herself stories. Not lies, but perspectives she was never allowed to voice. She says this was hard. She says I deserved more kindness. She says I loved, but I was also lonely. These are not dramatic things, but they are hers, and they matter. They are how she stitches herself back together, not as the perfect wife or the good mother, but as a full person who lived through something enormous and survived it. Because Victorian marriage didn't just demand a woman's labor, it demanded her identity. And she is one of many who gave it willingly. But now, she wants it back. She doesn't want a monument. She doesn't want revenge. She wants to be known. Not by others, by herself. And she is getting there, one page at a time, one morning at a time, one truth at a time. She is not starting over, she is starting finally. And that makes all the difference. The train pulls into the station with a soft exhale of steam. Outside the window, women in plain shawls and soot-streaked aprons wait for husbands returning from mines factories or long hours behind carts and counters. Their children cling to their skirts, their hands calloused even in youth. No silver tea sets here, no embroidery circles, no morning papers read in sunlit parlours. These are not the women of Mayfair or Kensington. These are the wives of coal towns, dockside streets and soot-soaked alleys. Their version of Victorian marriage is written not in journals, but in cracked hands and aching backs. If the upper classes lived within the confinement of social etiquette, the working classes lived within the tyranny of survival. Marriage was not an ornament, it was a necessity. Two people, often young, thrown together by need, more than affection, forging a life with the little they had. A warm body in winter, a pair of hands to share the work. A partner in name, if not always in spirit. And yet love lived here too, not the kind of love written in novels, but something quieter, more durable. He comes home reeking of iron and sweat. She greets him with a basin of warm water, not because it's expected, but because she knows what it's like to spend 12 hours on your feet and still be hungry. They don't exchange poems. They exchange crusts of bread, dry humor, an extra blanket, a look across the table that says, I know. I'm here. Odd fact, Victorian census records show that working class families often took in boarders to help pay rent. This meant privacy, especially marital privacy, was nearly non-existent. Couples lived, slept, and even gave birth in shared rooms. Historians still debate how these cramped conditions affected intimacy. Some argue it destroyed romance. Others suggest it created deep pragmatic partnerships built not on fantasy, but on endurance. There were no dowries here, no wedding trousseaux, sometimes no weddings at all, just unions sealed by time and proximity and shared hardship. She might meet him at the textile mill or the fish market. They marry after a few months because it's safer than not. Because her wages alone won't feed them both. Because the factory doesn't care if she's tired, but he might. The wedding, if it happens, is simple. A borrowed dress, a plain ring, cake if they're lucky. She doesn't dream of Venice. She dreams of one Sunday a month where she can sleep past dawn. Their marriage is a negotiation hour by hour. He works the early shift, she tends the children. She scrubs laundry, he scours floors. They argue about coins, about beer, about how much flour is left. But sometimes, just sometimes, they laugh. A real laugh. One that cuts through the soot and soothes burns and aching limbs. because humor is currency here. One of the only ones that doesn't run out. They raise children in alleyways and one-room flats. They lose some to fever, to work accidents, to hunger, and they grieve without fanfare because there is no time to mourn when the rent is due. But they keep going, because stopping is not an option. And in that resilience is a kind of intimacy. He patches her apron with rough stitches. She tucks bread into his coat pocket before he leaves. He doesn't say, "I love you." She doesn't ask him to. They don't need to. They are co-architects of a hard life, co-pilot in a world that gives them little and asks for much. She is not the angel in the house. She is the engine, the roof, the heat. And sometimes at night, when the youngest is finally asleep, she rests her head on his chest and exhales. And for a few minutes, she is not burdened. She is just a woman held by someone who understands. It is not poetry. It is not bliss. But it is real. And real here is rare and sacred. They grow old together, not with leisure, but with weathered hands and shared silence. And in that silence is recognition of what they built, of what they lost, of what they carried. And though no one will write books about them and no paintings will hang in parlors with their faces, their marriage, flawed, fragile, fierce, was a kind of defiance. In a world that gave them barely enough to survive, they created something enduring, not romantic in the storybook sense, but profoundly human. And maybe that is the truest love of all. The fire crackles softly in the grate. Rain taps lightly against the window panes, a rhythmic whisper in the quiet of the drawing room. She sits in her favorite chair, slightly worn at the arms, wrapped in a shawl that once belonged to her mother. In her lap, a letter half finished. On the table beside her, a cup of tea gone cold. And in her mind, a question she has asked herself every year, more often. What truly has marriage meant, she does not ask with regret. She asks as one might examine the stitching of an old quilt, running her fingers over each seam, seeing where it held and where it frayed. She remembers her wedding day, her hands trembling beneath white gloves, the hush of the church, the way her veil filtered the light, so everything looked like memory, even before it began. She remembers nights of silence, and others full of laughter, children born into rooms too cold, holidays where the turkey burned and no one noticed because they were too busy playing charades, moments when she thought she might vanish from it all, and others when she never felt more real. Marriage for her was not one thing. It was a dozen lifetimes stacked one atop the other. The marriage of early hope when she thought they'd be poets together. The marriage of young exhaustion when the crib never stopped rocking. The marriage of grief when they buried a child and didn't speak for 3 days. The marriage of rebuilding when they planted roses and touched hands again. The marriage of habit. The marriage of comfort. The marriage of simply being seen, however imperfectly. Odd fact. Queen Victoria, despite being the head of a global empire, famously wrote that a wife should yield entirely to her husband's will. Yet in her own marriage to Prince Albert, she was often the dominant voice politically and emotionally. Historians still debate whether this contradiction was personal performative or a reflection of her struggle between private feeling and public duty. Perhaps all women felt this tension, the tightrope between expectation and truth, between being what the world asked and what their heart whispered they might have been. She thinks about the other women now, the ones whose stories never made it into the history books, the ones who left, the ones who stayed, the ones who pretended, the ones who risked everything for a sliver of freedom. Some were broken by the life they entered with open eyes. Others found peace in unexpected places in the garden, in the morning light, in the voice of a daughter who dared to speak more boldly than her mother ever could. She thinks about how marriage changed as the century turned, about reformers and suffragettes and women's clubs, about laws shifting slowly like ice melting in spring, How women whispered to each other in drawing rooms and laundry lines and church pews, "It doesn't have to be like this forever." And how for the first time in generations that might have been true. She doesn't envy the younger women, but she hopes for them. She hopes they choose partners instead of protectors. She hopes they say no and mean it. She hopes they write their names without asking permission. She hopes they marry only if it makes them more themselves, not less. Her granddaughter visits now and then. A bright thing with ink-stained fingers and questions that tumble like river stones. "Did you love him?" "Yes," she says. "Were you happy?" She smiles. "Sometimes." That is enough, because happiness like marriage was never constant. It came in waves, in the scent of warm bread, in the way he kissed her wrist when she wasn't looking. In a Tuesday afternoon where no one needed anything and she read all the way to dusk. And when he died quietly in winter, she did not collapse. She tended the fire. She brewed tea. She wrote his name on the envelope and told the grocer just one loaf this week, because marriage does not end when the body leaves, not if it shaped the landscape of your soul. She does not want another. She does not need another. But she does want her story told, not because it was exceptional, but because it was real. And in the quiet of this last chapter, she writes not for anyone else. She writes for the girl she was, the woman she became, and the one still to come. So they will know marriage can be devotion, it can be duty, it can be delight, it can be a cage or a cathedral. But above all, it is not the only story. And your story is allowed to be bigger than your vows. It is allowed to begin again, even now, even here, even tonight,